Instagram. I'm not hard to find. I'm not hiding. So just different ways to get in touch with me. Okay. What else do we got going on? Anything else we need to talk about?
No, I think you covered it.
That's pretty much it. Well, here's what I got to tell you. If you're on the Patreon, we're not putting anything behind a paywall. Okay, we're just doing a Q&A to where you can get to know us a little bit better, and you can have time to talk to us. Because you're paying money every month. And so you're supporting the show. You're a supporter. You're helping keep the show going. And we appreciate that. And so that's one way of us being able to show our appreciation. We're not telling stories that you won't be able to hear on the show. So that's not the case. But you can ask questions about that week's episodes and we can go more in depth to it. So anyway, this story here comes from Latvia. And I don't know if you know where Latvia is. A lot of people probably, they're like, what is that? Where is that at? It is in Eastern Europe. It is below Estonia. Estonia is to the north, and to the east is Russia. To its west is the Baltic Sea. To the south west is Lithuania. To the southeast is Belarus. Now, here's what happened. We did a show called the Vampire. Was it the Vampire of Belarus?
I think it was like the Flying Vampire of Belarus, something like that.
I don't remember which. It was the Belarusian vampire, basically. And so we had a listener, and this is pretty cool. His name was Marta, and she got in touch with me. Her and her cousin her cousin lives in Riga. That's the capital of
Latvia.
Latvia, yeah. And now she's living there with her cousin. And her cousin got her started on the show. Well, the interesting thing is Marta reached out to me. She says, me and my cousin, we love your show. We're living in Riga. She's like, but that's not where we're from. We didn't grow up there. They actually grew up in a little bitty town that's right there on the border. It's called Sida, but it's south of Valka. And at one point, her dad, Marta's dad, is from Valka. And that is on the border with Estonia. It's right on the border of Estonia and Latvia. And here's what's interesting. When during World War II, it started in World War II. Okay, we'll go back to that. In 1943, the Germans, the war was in full swing between Germany and Russia, and they were losing ground, gaining ground. It was going back and forth, back and forth. I know some of you have heard the stories of the werewolves of World War II we did. That's another very, very popular episode. And so anyways, Marta and her cousin, they heard me talking about the stories that we had gotten from Belarus, and they thought, you know what, we live in Latvia and we have a story. And this is very interesting. We also got a Polish vampire story, or a Polish werewolf story, I believe is a werewolf. This creature here, I don't know. Vampire story. You can make up your own mind and decide what you think this is. I'm leaving it open to interpretation. I know what I kind of think it is, but I can't tell you, the listener, until we're done laying all the evidence of what we got, from these people. So what happened was, brother and sister Anna and Vladimir. These are the. I guess that would be the uncle and the grandmother, the great uncle and the grandmother of Marta. And so Marta says, my grandmother Anna told me a story when I was a kid, and it terrified me. And she goes, and my little brother was absolutely terrified. He wouldn't even go outside at night. And so she goes, for years, we all thought, me and my cousins and my siblings thought it was just a story that Anna had made up, Grandma Anna had made up, to keep us kids in line, to not go outside so that this thing wouldn't hurt us, attack us, whatever. Well, she goes, it worked. She said it worked a little too well because she wouldn't even go camping, and, there was just, but she found out later on that, Vladimir, her great uncle, and his sister, her grandmother, weren't lying about this. She found out that there were more people who had actually heard of this. Now, during the war, her grandmother's first cousin fell in love with a German officer, And when they were in full-on retreat, her family had been killed by the Soviets. So this German officer actually, they don't know exactly how it worked, but he smuggled her back into Germany. And they ended up getting into West Germany, and where he surrendered to the Allies. And he was not in the SS, he was in the Wehrmacht. And apparently, years later, she went to go visit these relatives that were living in, I guess is in West Germany. And so she goes, when we go to visit these relatives in West Berlin, she's like, we realized when we started talking, the kids were her age, her mother, this would have been her mother's like first cousin or whatever. And so she said that this cousin told her, I guess that would have been her grandmother's first cousin. So the mother and this woman their parents were first cousins. And so these were the people that they were friends with, and this happened after the wall fell. So they were able to go to Germany and visit. And she said it was amazing to go to West Germany and go to West Berlin, which was actually just Berlin now at that time. But this was the first Western country that she had visited. And she said it was just a very, normal night. They were talking, they were playing cards, and they were drinking a few drinks. And she said that it came up in conversation about this creature that they did not have a name for. It was just, in their Latvian language, it was just called the nameless thing. They didn't know what it was, but it was something that had been preying upon the people of this really small village right outside of Valka. And it had been going on for generations. And it had been taking livestock and then the occasional person, the straggler that would be walking home. Some people claimed it was a vampire. Some people claimed that it looked like a monster, like a hairy monster. And some people just said that it was a demon. They didn't know what it was. And they still to this day don't really have a name for it. But she said that there was a lot of people who knew about this creature, but they wouldn't talk about it because they felt like, and we know this, Tony coming from Vietnamese, and of course Ian Anthony, my mother being Hispanic descent, don't talk about it because if you talk about it, you talk it up and it'll show up. And so there's this terrifying, track record. They're like, if you talk about this creature, it's going to show up and it'll take you away. And supposedly it did that, right? To some people. So there was a guy, I don't know his name, but he was walking home from a bar one night in Valka to this little village where they were living. And this was in 1938 when this happened, supposedly. And this man was friends with her grandfather. And her grandfather, Alexander, had told her, he said that this man was walking home because she didn't believe it. So Grandma Anna told this story. So Alexander sat down one day. He took a shot of vodka and he looked at Marta as a child. He patted her on the head and he said, "Let me tell you the story of my friend who was walking home one night. And he said, I challenge this thing to do something to me, if it's real." And he looked up toward the heavens when he said it. He walked outside of the tavern that they were in, and then he proceeded to walk home alone, which was only about a 4-kilometer walk, and he was never seen again. So shortly after this, the Russians had already, the Soviets, they would be the Soviets at that time, had already laid down on Latvia and had control of it, but they were not as, they were spread thin. They had soldiers all over the Eastern Bloc. And so they did not have, it wasn't as bad as it was after the war. After the war, Stalin became very paranoid and he put huge garrisons all over this Eastern Bloc, in particular Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, Belarus, and Ukraine were very suppressed. They had a lot of attention from Russia. And then, of course, Hungary, Bulgaria, Poland, Czechoslovakia, all of them they went under the boot heel of the Soviet Union. It's a very horrible, miserable thing that happened. But back then they still had some freedom. And then in 1939, war broke out, and of course Russia invaded Poland, and all hell broke loose. And then the Germans invaded Russia a couple years later. They broke the treaty and they attacked. And so we're not going to get into a big history lesson. We don't have time, or I would. But what happened was when they went back and they met these half German cousins, they started talking about this. And the first cousin of her grandmother, who was still alive, and her daughter, I don't know her name, but they were all there. They were talking about this creature, and she says, "Look, your grandmother was not wrong about this." So, her grandmother had been saying that there was this creature. Now, supposedly, it attacked her and her little brother Vladimir when she was 14 and he was 11, and they escaped from it. Now, according to the official story that was put out by whatever, I guess the newspapers at that time, was that there was a flap and people were seeing a giant bird. But that's not what happened. According to the people who this happened to, this was not a giant bird. And what this thing looked like was anything but a bird. It had this black skin. It only appeared at night, and it was black like the darkness black. Like you see the darkness, you could only see it. It was like darker than the night sky, especially on a moonlit night. And it had a very demonic face. It had a short muzzle with huge teeth, and it had pointy ears, and it had a big pointy nose, and the nose hung down kind of over the lips, and this thing had glowing red eyes, and you could see it coming from the sky, and it would make this screeching, howling noise, and you could hear the wings flapping, and the wings were very specific. They were bat-like wings. This thing had long, skinny arms, and skinny legs, and a skinny torso with big talons on the feet and the hands. The legs were backward bent like a dog like legs, and it protruded like this. When it would open its mouth to bite people, it was like the mouth would kind of come out. The lips would curl back, and it seemed like the teeth would kind of jut out of the mouth. They watched this thing devour sheep. They watched it kill dogs. They watched it kill cattle, even pick up full-grown cows and take off and abscond with them. And it was just, the predation was horrible, to where that whole area was like in a panic. And by the time the Germans had invaded and driven the Soviets back, they were treated kind of as liberators, right? And the people of Seda, which is, like I said, it's like southwest of Valka, that whole area right there, they were in a tizzy. They were terrified. And so they asked the German soldiers if they could do something about it. At first, the Germans were taken aback and were like, "What is this? What are you talking about?" And they said that they were describing this creature to the Germans. And surprisingly, most of the Germans didn't know what the hell they were talking about, but some of them did. Like a couple of the higher-ups were like, "Okay, yeah." And one of the German officers, who was actually a lower-ranking German officer, who ended up marrying her grandmother Anna's first cousin, who they said was very beautiful, he managed to smuggle her back and got across to West Berlin, to surrender to Patton. So what ended up happening, he got put in a POW camp. He eventually got out and got with his love that he had met in Latvia, and they got married and had children. He was already deceased by the time that they had gone to visit their family in West Berlin. But she's like, "I'll never forget that night." She goes, "I was 19 at the time when they went to go visit this family, whatever." And she said, "We were in West Berlin, and we had gone dancing to a club or whatever. And it hadn't been that long since the wall had fallen. It was a couple years." And she said that it was awesome time to be alive, And the German people were still trying to get accustomed to being around each other. The West and East Germans were totally different people at that time. And she said that they had cousins that were from East Germany and that they were coming and visiting. And one of those cousins, a guy named Hans, had actually said that he had served with the man who ended up marrying Anna's cousin. And he said, I was there. And he goes, and I remember this creature, the nameless thing. And he's like, it looked like what we would call in Germany a vampire. That's what it looked like. It was a flying creature and it exsanguinated animals. But it would also eat their flesh, but it would predominantly drink blood. And it attacked several of their soldiers. And one of the most gruesome things that happened was this particular German, he said, when we had entered into a barn right there in Seda, right outside of Seda, there was this guy had a big farm right there, and the Russians had laid down like an ambush for the Germans. But when they got there, apparently they had all been killed. By what, they don't know. And they honestly didn't believe that it was just one creature because it looked like they had shot each other up. Which is really interesting. I was reading about a place in Finland where it's like the mountain of death. And it's something I want to talk about eventually. I'm going to talk about it on the show. I'll do this story too. And something very similar had happened to the Russians. 100 Russians had been killed. There was a war called the Winter War. And Anthony, I'm sure you know what that is. The Finnish had fought the Russians prior to World War II. And then, of course, they helped invade the Soviet Union because they were Germany's ally. But before that happened, there was this war. And, of course, the Finnish never went up onto that hill. They just didn't do it. And the Laplanders from Finland, they're like the natives, right? They're from that region. They were like kind of like Eskimo people. They were like, don't do it. They told the Russians not to do it. And the Russians were stubborn. And instead of listening to these people, they're called the Sami people. They actually just murdered them. And stupidly, the Finnish knew better. The Finnish were like, no, the Laplanders, the Sami, they don't go up there to that mountain. And so it's a long story, but it's a very good story. And I'm going to get into that one day. And I have somebody who gave me information about that story. But they called it the Mountain of Death. And these Russians, same thing. The Russians were communists, so they didn't believe in anything. They didn't believe in any of these stories. Whereas the Germans, they did. They had a lot more, I guess they were a lot more superstitious. The Russian soldier was conditioned to not believe in God, not to believe in anything, and to be very superstitious, not to be superstitious at all. So even if they were raised with these, what they considered peasant ideas of ghosts and goblins and Baba Yaga, you were not allowed to have those beliefs. You served at the will of the Communist Party, and that was it. And so it seemed like the Russians had shot each other in their own ambush. So when Hans and his unit went in, they found Russian soldiers scattered all over the place that were dead. Them and Latvian troops that had been conscripted to join they were forced to join the Russian military, and so they followed it all up into a barn where they found half-eaten, half-chewed-on Latvian and Russian soldiers, and a couple that were literally like bloodless, that were hanging upside down and that had been drained of blood. So whatever had done this had caused some serious carnage. There was like 15, 16 bodies that had been killed, but it looked like they didn't all die in the same way or at the same time. They couldn't figure it out. It was like a mystery. And so they cleared the bodies out, and they used this area that the Russians had set up as like a makeshift base or whatever, So the Germans took it over. Well, the first night that they were there, according to what this man told Anna's family, Marta's family, he said, we heard this screeching, like howling noise coming from the sky. And then we saw the top of the barn just literally collapse and fall in. And several of the soldiers that were there, this was an SS unit, and they began to open fire on this, what they described as an 8-foot tall, massive black creature with humongous wings. The wingspan, they claimed, was 6 foot across on each wing, which was about 12 feet. So this thing was massive. The wings were freaking massive. And it came down and swooped in and just unalived 2 soldiers like immediately, just slicing through them and nearly decapitating them, and then began to like devour them quickly, drinking their blood. As they opened fire, they ended up like wounding one another. And then they realized after this thing left and absconded with one of the bodies, they realized this is probably what happened to these Latvian and Russian soldiers. So they went to the local Latvians and they asked them there in Sida, and they asked them, they said, what is going on here? What is this thing? Do you know anything about it? Why are we being attacked by this creature? And they said, this thing has been attacking people in Valka and in Sida, and then there's these other little towns, around that area, little villages and stuff. And it's been doing it for decades. It had been going on since the 1800s, as far back as anybody could remember. And some of the people that were still alive from the 1800s, the elderly, the elders, they were talking about this creature, and they claimed that it was brought across from the Baltic, from some other place, and that it was like it just appeared one day on an abandoned ship from the Baltic, and they don't know how or where it came from. But after that ship arrived, it just moved its way from town to town to town, and there were reports of it going across, all the way across Latvia, parts of Estonia, and it ended up in Valka. And so that's the best story that they could come up with. Now, this could just be something that they used to make up this whole whatever, just so they could explain how this creature was doing whatever it did. But the truth is, they probably really didn't know. But the Germans were smart, and they set a trap for this thing. And they used a dead cow that had been killed by the Russians, and they set it up outside of this barn. And sure enough, that night, it came back down to try to feast on this cow. And they managed to shoot it several times in the back, and it did actually work. They used a high-powered 20 mil to blast a giant hole through this creature, and it looked like they had killed it. Once this 20 mil hit and it knocked this creature down, it appeared that they had knocked a giant hole in its chest, and it was dead. So they put nets on it, they wrapped it up, they put the arms behind its back, and they hung it up in the barn. And when the higher ups came in, one of the generals had came through there. Now, general is not the highest rank in their military. It's a field marshal. But one of the generals came through there supposedly with his people, and one of his understudies came in and told him, I guess he had like the rank of colonel, and he told him, he says, what is this? And they said, this is a creature that killed 2 of our men, and it also unalived all these Russian and Latvian people. They have this whole story about it in this village. They say that it's been doing this for years, and it just goes from town to town, and there's records of it and blah, blah, blah. A few of these Germans actually had made their way across this country by the time they had gotten this far east, and they had heard of this thing. They had heard of a flying creature in northern Latvia that had been predating on animals and killing people occasionally, and that it was sort of a vampiric type entity. They don't know what it is or what it was, whatever, blah, blah, blah. So the Germans were convinced that it was something that the Soviets had created, right? So they were going to take it and send it back to Germany and send it back to the West to their scientists so they could get a bead and figure out what it was. So they brought a transport in, and they loaded this thing up to the back of the truck. Well, They didn't even make it out of the town. They got like halfway out of the town, and next thing you know, this thing is alive and well, and it's attacking the soldiers in the back of this truck that are supposed to be guarding it. And one of them fell out the back of the truck and broke his neck, and two of them were disemboweled. And then this thing broke its way out of the back and was flying through the air again. The hole in its body supposedly was healing up, right? Now, Martha said she was completely enthralled by this story of this creature. And she did some research, and she found out that the first sighting of this creature in that area where she was from was in this little bitty town called Ladana, which is like, I don't know if that's a little bitty village or whatever. It's not on the map, but I guess it was in between Seda and Volka, some little bitty village or whatever, was pretty much wiped out by the Soviets when they came back to drive the Germans out. They were accused of helping the Germans, which a lot of Latvians did, and they were burned alive. So they killed like 370 people. They just murdered them, which is what the Soviets were really good at. And so, you know, these people, they suffered bad because they had to deal with the Soviets being on top of them. Then the Germans came, and then the Soviets drove them back out. And so it was horrible. It was just like what happened with the Belarusians. You fight for us or die, then the next army comes in, fight for us, or you die, you know, basically. So they just went back and forth, and it was just death all around. And this creature was enjoying this carnage. But the first sighting was in 1886 was the first time that, but according to some of the officials that had, in Volka, they had actually said that this thing was not the first time that it was seen in Latvia, that it was actually seen in a city called Alaja or Alaja, I don't know. She wrote it down as Alaja. And that's where it was first documented that this creature had made an appearance. It was just an unidentified flying creature that had taken off with someone's sheep, a local shepherd. The next night, he disappeared. So we don't know a whole lot about where this creature really was from or what it was. We just know that it appeared, and the next thing you know, all hell breaks loose, and then it goes from town to town, and it just raised hell. And then in parts of southern Estonia, there's stories of this thing where that it had murdered people and livestock, animals, whatever. But according to what Anna, her grandmother, had said, her and her brother Vladimir, after the war, the Russians had taken back control, and they captured this creature. And they had it in a metal crate with bars and everything. And she says her and her brother snuck to the rail station to go and look to see it. And they saw it. And she said that it was a pitiful looking thing, and that it was hunched over with its head down between its knees. And she said that her brother, overcome with the feeling of sadness for this creature, and then he started to think the stories about it weren't even true. It was just Soviet and German propaganda. So he decided to try to reach into the cage and give it some bread.
What a great idea.
Yeah. Of course, he's a kid, you know. And so she said before Sonia, their cousin, could even that's her name, Sonia. Before Sonia, the cousin, could even react, this thing had grabbed him by the arm and had bitten him, and he fell backwards, and big chunk of his arm was taken out, and he ended up going to the hospital and nearly dying. And so they ended up having to take him to Riga, which is the capital, and give him multiple blood transfusions because he wouldn't stop bleeding. Now get this. Whatever this thing had in its saliva, it was an anticoagulant because the blood, it would not coagulate. His blood continued to flow, and he nearly bled to death.
Don't vampire bats have something
exactly similar? Yeah, that's one thing I thought about. So she said that they said that, are you sure this was some kind of creature? They described it, but the Soviets had already shipped it off back to the east. And then somewhere when in Russia, when they got back to Russia, the stories are, now this, I don't know how they know this, but the story goes that it ended up getting loose and it was flying around somewhere over Western Russia, and it was wreaking havoc. And she said that there are stories from the Russians who actually ended up living in Latvia and claimed, yeah, that thing escaped off the train and killed multiple soldiers and ended up, living somewhere in Western Russia. Nobody knows where it came from or what it is, but it does sound very similar to some of the accounts that we get of these flying creatures near Baalbek, in Lebanon.
Yeah.
And so one of my friends is Lebanese. I asked him about that, and I described this to him, and you know who I'm talking about. He actually told me, he says, dude, that sounds almost identical to one of these creatures from the pits of Baalbek, which is, that's where they used to worship Baal, Haman Baal in particular. And, of course, there is a giant pit there that's been covered over with giant stone to keep whatever is in there from coming out. But every now and then they have to redo this and fix it, and they say that whenever they do, there's always at least one or two workers that ends up dying because something always manages to get out of it, and then they go and it flies around and does whatever it does and kills people. And supposedly many, many people died before they covered that hole. And it's very well known in Lebanon that if you go to that place, you can hear these demonic creatures screeching and howling underneath the giant stone that covers the well or hole of Baalbek. And so I don't know that this is what this was. I don't know if it was something, some people say it was something that the Germans had brought, that they had captured in the Middle East because they had a lot of allies in the Middle East. And so they may have been given something, or it could have been the Soviets. The Soviets were, they had captured, a lot of territory, and they had invaded a part of Iran. So they thought maybe this thing was taken back from the Persians. They don't know. They don't really know exactly where it came from. There is another case that I found of a creature very similar in Georgia, in southern Russia. It's another country that became part of Russia. But this story in particular, Marta claims that she did some sleuthing and she found out that Vladimir was very sickly the rest of his life and that he needed kidney dialysis when he got older, which he couldn't get, and he eventually died, and he never was the same. And he couldn't go out in the sun. He developed an affliction that made him not be able to go out in the sun without being burned, and that his eyes couldn't see in the daylight, and it was whatever this thing was, it gave him something, and his blood, he was always needing blood transfusions, and that he would start bleeding. He became hemophiliac. Prior to that, he wasn't. So I don't know. When you stop and you look at this case of this flying creature, we here at PRT, we've done a lot of work with international cases and things like that and talking to people from all over the world. And thank goodness that we did the story about Belarus, because we never would have got this story. But, when he heard us talking about this particular case, another cool thing, too, is just a sideline. One of her cousins plays Age of Empire. And I think I played against him when she started telling me about it. I said, I think I know him. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But anyway, a lot of these Eastern Europe, they like that game. And they also play that one game. What's it? It's been around forever. The one where they go in and they have like whole rooms where they play it. It's very popular. Still, it's an old game.
I mean, what kind of game is it?
It's like a first-person shooter game. I think
Counter-Strike?
Counter-Strike. There you go.
Yeah.
So anyway, she says my cousin plays Counter-Strike, and I was like, yeah, he probably played against my nephews. So Counter-Strike has been around forever, but that's one of the games they play too. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. That's just me, the gamer in me, that I don't get to play games much anymore, but I used to love video games. But yeah, we started talking, and very interesting. Marta's very interesting. One of her cousins, he's Nikolai, he's a very intelligent guy, a microbiologist, and he is very intrigued by whatever this disease was that was given to their great uncle, Vladimir, and what it could have been. And then he was sterile. He never could have children after this happened. And they think that before that he was a healthy young boy, and then he ended up with this affliction or illness, whatever. Well, years later, before he died, Soviet troops came to their house and drug him out of the apartment that they lived in, and he was taken from Latvia to Moscow. And he lived there for 2 years, and then he was returned. When he was returned, he was an emaciated shell of his former self, and that they had done all kinds of experiments on him. And the Latvian authorities, of course, they had turned him over to the Soviets because they had no control. The Soviets controlled everything. Really, it was Russia. And they think that he was being looked at because they knew that this creature was responsible for turning him into whatever he was. And like maybe some sort of hybrid, it's a blood disorder for sure. But they claimed that he had some sort of parasite that was unkillable. That's what he was diagnosed with. And so the Latvian and Russian authorities said, well, this guy's got some kind of parasite. We can't get rid of it. We don't know what it is. His blood was a very dark color, almost black. Whenever they would take his blood, it was like a deep, dark color, and it looked almost like black goo.
And it's a parasite, which is what we talked about on Vampire Confessions and Werewolf Confessions.
Yeah. And so this creature, it sounds an awful lot like a rogue elder of these vampire creatures.
That's what I was thinking, that it's like one of those primordial, like very ancient vampire creatures from which the modern day ones,
all
descend.
Kind of hail from, yeah. And so here's an interesting thing. In that same community, in that little bitty village or whatever, Ladona, whatever it was, that little village that was wiped out, there was supposedly a witch. I guess he would be considered a warlock. And the villagers were terrified of this guy. And he was considered to be able to shapeshift, and that he had a wolf's pelt that he could use to change into a wolf. And a lot of people were really scared to death of this guy. And so whenever this creature started doing whatever it was doing, people were going to this guy and paying him with, I'm talking like giving him hens and eggs and sheep and whatever they could pay him with. One family even gave him a mule, whatever, just to give the protection from this creature. And supposedly he was the only person in that village that was safe from this creature, because he would roam around at night and nothing would ever happen to him. And if he was around, that it was said that if he was around or if you were with him, particularly, he seemed to be benign too, according to her grandmother. She said he was a nice old hermit guy, but everybody was terrified of him because he could change into a werewolf. And supposedly he was the only one who had no fear of the nameless thing. And he would tell them, he goes, I know exactly what that thing is. It can't hurt me. It won't hurt me. And if it tries, I'll kill it. But it's not going to come down to the land and fight with me. It's just going to be up in the air. And he also raised sheep. And he had a herd of sheep. And sometimes he'd be seen sleeping out there with his flock. And he was the only one in the whole area for 30 kilometers around that could do that, because everyone else had to pin their sheep up at night because this thing